Book 4, Chapter 6 of History of Florence. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of Florence and of the Affairs of Italy, Volume 1, by Niccolo Machiavelli, translator unknown. Book 4, Chapter 6. Cosmo de' Medici, his character and mode of proceedings. The greatness of Cosmo excites the jealousy of the citizens. The opinion of Niccolo da Uzzano. Scandalous divisions of the Florentines. Death of Niccolo da Uzzano. Bernardo Guadagni, Gonfalonier, adopts measures against Cosmo. Cosmo arrested in the palace. He is apprehensive of attempts against his life. During the war, the malignant humors of the city were in constant activity. Cosmo de' Medici, after the death of Giovanni, engaged more earnestly in public affairs, and conducted himself with more zeal and boldness in regard to his friends than his father had done, so that those who rejoiced at Giovanni's death, finding what the son was likely to become, perceived they had no cause for exultation. Cosmo was one of the most prudent of men, of grave and courteous demeanor, extremely liberal and humane. He never attempted anything against parties or against rulers, but was bountiful to all, and by the unwearied generosity of his disposition made himself partisans of all ranks of the citizens. This mode of proceeding increased the difficulties of those who were in the government, and Cosmo himself hoped that by its pursuit he might be able to live in Florence as much respected and as secure as any other citizen; or if the ambition of his adversaries compelled him to adopt a different course, arms and the favor of his friends would enable him to become more so. Averardo de' Medici and Puccio Pucci were greatly instrumental in the establishment of his power, the former by his boldness, the latter by unusual prudence and sagacity, contributed to his aggrandizement. Indeed, the advice of wisdom of Puccio were so highly esteemed that Cosmo's party was rather distinguished by the name of Puccio than by his own. By this divided city the enterprise against Lucca was undertaken, and the bitterness of party spirit, instead of being abated, increased. Although the friends of Cosmo had been in favor of it, many of the adverse faction were sent to assist in the management, as being men of greater influence in the state. Averardo de' Medici and the rest being unable to prevent this, endeavored with all their might to calumniate them; and when any unfavorable circumstance occurred, and there were many, fortune and the exertions of the enemy were never supposed to be the causes, but solely the want of capacity in the commissary. This disposition aggravated the offences of Astorre Gianni; this excited the indignation of Rinaldo degli Albizzi, and made him resign his commission without leave; this, too, compelled the captain of the people to require the appearance of Giovanni Guicciardini; and from this arose all the other charges which were made against the magistrates and the commissaries. Real evils were magnified, and real ones feigned, and the true and the false were equally believed by the people, who were almost universally their foes. All these events and extraordinary modes of proceeding were perfectly known to Niccolo da Uzzano and the other leaders of the party, and they had often consulted together for the purpose of finding a remedy, but without effect, though they were aware of the danger of allowing them to increase, and the great difficulties that would attend any attempt to remove or abate them. Niccolo da Uzzano was the earliest to take offense; and while the war was proceeding without, and these troubles within, Niccolo Barbadoro, desirous of inducing him to consent to the ruin of Cosmo, waited upon him at his house, and finding him alone in his study, and very pensive, endeavored, with the best reasons he could advance, to persuade him to agree with Rinaldo on Cosmo's expulsion. Niccolo da Uzzano replied as follows: It would be better for thee and thy house, as well as for our republic, if thou and those who follow thee in this opinion had birds of silver instead of gold, as is said of thee; for advice proceeding from the hoary head of long experience would be wiser and of greater service to all. It appears to me that those who talk of driving Cosmo out of Florence would do well to consider what is their strength and what that of Cosmo. You have named one party, that of the nobility, the other that of the plebeians. If the fact corresponded with the name, the victory would still be most uncertain, and the example of the ancient nobility of this city, who were destroyed by the plebeians, ought rather to impress us with fear than with hope. We have, however, still further cause for apprehension from the division of our party and the union of our adversaries. In the first place, Neri di Gino and Nerone di Nigi, two of our principal citizens, have never so fully declared their sentiments as to enable us to determine whether they are most our friends or those of our opponents. There are many families, even many houses, divided; many are opposed to us through envy of brothers or relatives. I will recall to your recollection two or three of the most important. You may think of the others at your leisure. Of the sons of Maso degli Albizzi, Luca, from envy of Rinaldo, has thrown himself into their hands. In the house of Guicciardini, of the sons of Luigi, Piero is the enemy of Giovanni, and did favor to our adversaries. Tommaso and Niccolo Soderini openly oppose us on account of their hatred of their uncle Francesco; so that if we consider well what we are and what our enemies, I cannot see why we should be called noble any more than they. If it is because they are followed by the plebeians, we are in a worse condition on that account, and they in a better; for were it to come either to arms or to votes, we should not be able to resist them. True it is, we still preserve our dignity, our precedence, the priority of our position; but this arises from the former reputation of the government, which has now continued 50 years, and whenever we come to the proof, or they discover our weakness, we shall lose it. If you were to say, the justice of our cause ought to augment our influence and diminish theirs, I answer that this justice requires to be perceived and believed by others as well as by ourselves; but this is not the case, for the justice of our cause is wholly founded upon our suspicion that Cosmo designs to make himself prince of the city. And although we entertain this suspicion and suppose it to be correct, others have it not; but what is worse, they charge us with the very design of which we accuse him. Those actions of Cosmo which lead us to suspect him are, that he lends money indiscriminately, and not to private persons only, but to the public; and not to Florentines only, but to the condottieri, the soldiers of fortune. Besides, he assists any citizen who requires magistral aid, and by the universal interest he possesses in the city, raises first one friend and then another to higher grades of honor. Therefore, to adduce our reasons for expelling him would be to say that he is kind, generous, liberal, and beloved by all. Now tell me, what law is there which forbids, disapproves, or condemns men for being pious, liberal, or benevolent? And though they are all modes adopted by those who aim at sovereignty, they are not believed to be such, nor have we sufficient power to make them to be so esteemed; for our conduct has robbed us of confidence, and the city, naturally partial, and having always lived in faction, corrupt, cannot lend its attention to such charges. But even if we were successful in an attempt to expel him, which might easily happen under a favorable Signory, how could we, being surrounded by his innumerable friends, who would constantly reproach us and ardently desire to see him again in the city, prevent his return? It would be impossible, for they being so numerous,